Hello, this is Darren Pulsipher, Chief Solution Architect of Public Sector at Intel, and welcome to Embracing Digital Transformation, where we investigate effective change leveraging people, process, and technology. On today's episode, Becoming a Data-Ready Organization with special guest, retired Rear Admiral Ron Fritzmeier. Ron, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Darren. Glad to be here.
Hey, Ron, it's always a pleasure talking to you. You come from a great heritage and on the Intel team with lots of other former Navy. Give us a little bit of your background so our audience can understand more who they're listening to today.
Sure. By education, I am an electrical engineer. And I actually started out my career in microelectronics for the government at Sandia Labs. And while I was at the labs, I actually found out about the Navy. And I won't go into all the details of why that was of interest to me, but I joined the Navy actually as a reserve career. So I had for much of my career kind of a dual government civilian and then Navy career. It just turned out that by chance, when the Navy decided to promote me to Rear Admiral, but they also said, oh, by the way, we want you full time. So I actually finished my career for several years on active duty, kind of reverse of the normal way that works.
I was going to say, Admiral Fritzmeier, you did it backwards.
I did it backwards, but it worked out well for my wife because my wife, I married her just before I went on duty as a flag officer. And so she didn't know anything about the military except being a flag officer's wife. And she stepped up to the task big time. It was pretty amazing, actually, how she jumped.
That's pretty incredible. So a background in electrical engineering, but you're kind of a cyber guy.
Yeah. So early on in my career, because of really the microelectronics, it turned out one of my super skills, if you will, was I was great at breaking things, and that got me into reverse engineering and sort of the black hat business, which I won't go into all the details there, but it was basically how things can go wrong when you're intending to try and make them secure and operable. And that just seemed like a natural piece falling into sort of the cyber world. And so in fairly short order, I found myself doing more in sort of, I'll say, the cyberspace than other things, although I did a lot of comms and other C4I type engineering work over the years. But heavy emphasis on cyber and cybersecurity. In fact, even in my civilian career, that ended up being a large part of what I did, driving operations where we were frankly taking advantage of the fact that other people aren't good at their cybersecurity, as well as trying to improve national security agency work, not all NSA, but broadly speaking, national security agencies, cybersecurity. So that led into my Navy portion of my career, where I was the chief engineer out at the Navy Systems Command that today is known as NAVWAR, and also spent time at Stratcom helping drive the NC3 enterprise modernization.
So great pedigree. Obviously, I'm talking to someone who knows their stuff. But we're not talking cybersecurity today. We're talking the big, huge push right now that we're seeing everywhere is AI, specifically generative AI. But to make that work, we need data behind it. And managing data is a key aspect to that, both on the cyber side as well as on operations, and especially now with generative AI. What's your take on data management? Is it a well-known art? Why, I mean, where are we at with the state of this?
So even from the early days of my career, when we had to basically certify components that were going into, in this case, nuclear weapon systems or space systems. So you have these really high reliability requirements. There was always this notion that you had to develop and maintain all kinds of data as part of validation and certification packages of whatever those systems or subsystems were. But all of it, looking back on it, very, very manual intensive, right? And so I had experiences kind of almost in tranches throughout my career where I saw this notion of, as we moved more and more into sort of a data-driven and I'll say IT-driven world where information technology is sort of underpinning, not just nice to have, but it's fundamentally what enables you to drive whatever your business is, right? In my case, it was always sort of national security systems, is that we struggled with this notion of how do I turn my data into something that I use more and more effectively in sort of this IT automated data-driven world. And I have example after example. One for the Navy would be how we would go about preparing for ships when they're coming back from deployment and they're going to come into a maintenance and modernization cycle. And the issue is that while that ship is...
And how often does that maintenance cycle happen for these ships? Because a lot of people aren't familiar
it
with that.
depends. And there's actually multiple cycles. So after every deployment, there's by definition some level of maintenance cycle. It may be very, very minimal because the ship may, in fact, I'll say come home and turn right around in a matter of days or a few weeks. But then there's like major modernization cycles, and it's sort of a function of the different ship systems and so on, and expectation of how long things will operate before they break down to the point where you have to replace or do major repairs, right? So it's a variation of those cycles, but I'm talking about cycles that typically would happen in the 2 to 3 year time frame where a ship has been out on maybe a few deployments and they've had minor work done in between on those deployments, but now they're coming back for some kind of what would be considered a major modernization or major repair, what we would call a major ship availability. And in order to prepare for that availability, as you can imagine, our ships are very, very complex systems. I mean, some of them are, for all intents and purposes, small floating cities, right? So imagine all of the systems that are involved in operating that ship. And oh, by the way, in case you're not aware of it, the maritime environment is a very, very tough environment. Awesome. It's hard on everything, right? So when ships come back, there's a lot of engineering and planning that goes into those maintenance cycles. But the first thing you really need is what is the actual state of the ship, quote, today, right? You need to know how it was planned, but you also need to know what's happened to the ship over time. And as you might imagine, nothing stays terribly static on a ship throughout a deployment, right? Because you got to keep it running. So all kinds of things happen. So part of the availability preparation is you actually send out a team of people who essentially go out and do all kinds of measurements and preparation for modernization, where you're going to be taking out systems and putting in new stuff potentially, but also assessing the current state of all the systems on the ship as best you can, because it's still underway, right? So you can't do everything. You can't rip everything apart, but to the extent that you can assess the state of things, that allows for the planners back home to be preparing work packages for what has to actually be done in the availability. The issue becomes that has historically been potentially large groups of people that are flown out to the ship along with ship's force, right, to attempt to do all these measurements and assessments. And you can imagine these guys basically with tape measures and clipboards and writing stuff down, right? I mean, it's that hardcore. But every one of those things brings in the opportunity from a human standpoint for human error. And so historically, what we've seen is that you expect that there's going to be, errors and missing data and all those kinds of things. And so how do you deal with that? Well, when you're just dealing with the data manually, you sort of expect that, and that's just a natural part of the process. But as you try and automate analysis and assessment to move things forward, the quality of your data becomes even more important as you look to try and build processes to take advantage of it to move yourself forward.
So that's an interesting point. I want to emphasize a little bit. Your data collection is critical for taking advantage of automation. Because in the past, before you would look at automation, there were people involved. So they could make up the difference in the lack of data collected, right? Because, I know something about this ship already. They measured something that I know is not 100 yards. It's only 90 yards. Things like that, because there's some tribal knowledge or some tacit knowledge that's sitting there. So, but when you automate, like you said, all of a sudden that those nuances in the data are completely lost, right? And the gaps in the data are now causing gaps in your analysis as well.
Another thing that I saw over time was even in places where we had started building systems to better collect data, there was the notion of there's still the human in the loop for the data collection process at some level, right? And so we had systems when we started saying, okay, now that we've actually built a fairly substantial data collection system, let's talk about how we analyze the data differently and again, move toward more automation to speed the process and to frankly take better advantage of the data. That was once again where we learned that how you go about collecting data actually makes a big difference. And one, for instance, is when you have a situation where, and I'll use a maintenance example, you have a maintainer that's looking at a platform. The one I'm actually thinking of is actually an aircraft platform, but it's the same across the board, right? And they have been given this form that they have to fill out, right? And they may even put the form on a computer. So now we've computerized data collection, right? But the guy still sits down at the keyboard and types stuff in.
And he's typing
and because as we've designed it, we ask them different kinds of questions that in many cases are subjective. And sometimes the maintainer says, well, I don't really know the answer to that, but I have to fill in the field because we put into the computer program that collects the data a requirement for something to be in that field. So we end up with, we end up with data sets sometimes that says, I love mom. It's like, what? It let me get past the screen, right? It let me get past the screen and I didn't know what to put in there and it made me do something.
That is hilarious. That is hilarious. But you're right. But you're right, right? I mean, this totally makes sense. So what do you do? Do we want to take the human out of the loop? Because humans, we are unpredictable. We go around things. If we don't know something, we just make something up. Right. I mean, we're horrible. We're horrible at content generation that's consistent. Right.
So to me, there are a couple things that came out of it. One was, and once again, this might sound bad, but working in the government, I've seen this happen so many times. We don't oftentimes, when we're trying to build these systems to help people collect the data that we need, we don't actually think very much about the person who's actually doing that front end collection, right? And so we give them a tool that it's almost like, I think of, websites that today people go to without even thinking about to go shopping, right? The science behind how many clicks a person has to produce or make in order to get success is huge.
Yeah.
Yet in so many cases in our systems when we don't think of that person at the front end of our data as really being a customer in that sense, we don't necessarily design the systems to make it easy. And so my experience has been, if you don't make it easy for the person to do the right thing, by definition, you made it easier for them to do the wrong thing in terms of the data collection. And thus you have one of the challenges of being a data ready organization is you need to think about the entire life cycle of your data from the very start of collection all the way through how you manage it and process it to take strategic advantage of it, right? And I think it's important to recognize that there's several stages of all of that data readiness that you want to work through because there's probably room for most organizations to improve in every one of those areas.
I like that approach, Ron, because what typically happens is people focus on one area independent of the others, right? Oh, we'll do better at data collection. Give all those guys LiDAR on the ship. So they walk in with LiDAR. Great. There's still subjective things, right, that they have to, even if you gave visualization to them, LiDAR and a camera, and they walked around the ship, there's things that they're going to smell or see or, feel that camera and other sensors just can't do.
Right.
Not yet. Just give it some time, right. I guess. So that's an interesting, I like how you're pulling that all together. What do you do as far as once the data is collected? There's going to be some dirtiness in the data regardless, right? Even in fully automated systems like cyber threat detection is a great example. There's lots of noise in that data that's generated. What do you do about all that noise? How do you filter it out? Do you keep it all? This is a big question I know a lot of people have. They're afraid to throw away anything for fear that that data that they have may have some nuggets of insight in there that they're missing out
Yeah,
on.
I think this is maybe sort of the magic. And I had a data scientist that worked for me when I was back at Spay Wars, now Nav Wars, I mentioned. And his counsel, I thought, was really good. Is that so many people, when they sort of get, I'll say, data religion, right? We're now going to be a data-driven organization.
Yeah, we're data-driven. Yeah.
They without thinking about it, they imagine that they're going to boil the ocean. And he said, no, let's start with get a teaspoon and say, what do I want to do with this teaspoonful of this data, right? What am I going to do with it? And so driving with intent of what makes my mission more successful, either improving efficiency or improving performance or both, right? Or reducing some other cost, trying to understand what is your objective and using the data to strategically drive your business. And then do that as sort of a look back at, so what data actually helps me do that? So there is, I think, a real analytic process of saying, how do I expect to use my data to achieve mission success, right? And if you look really hard at that, I think what people will find is that you may be collecting data that is actually not helping you drive to those answers, right? Or, as you point out, you may have some dirty data, and then you need to ask the question. I think if you're doing it in sort of a focused analysis where you're not trying to boil the ocean, you could say, okay, if I have a lot of this data, but it's only 80% quality, whatever that would mean, right? Does it still drive me based on my analysis to a useful answer? And again, without going into the specifics, there was a great Navy example of this where we had a very large corpus of maintenance data on a system. And we started saying, what can we do to speed the maintenance process, right? To improve aspects of the maintenance. And as we started trying to look at the data and to say, where do we see indicators of events that if we made a different decision there, it would improve our maintenance cycle? We saw, one, we had dirty data, but two, we had a lot of data. And so even with, I'll say, the dirtiness of the data, we were kind of able with analytics to overcome that. So you don't necessarily have to have perfect data, but you need to understand, do your analytics still seem to drive you to a reasonable conclusion, right?
So I like that, right? You talked about finding out where your data is, what data you have access to, and how you can leverage that data to get analytics. And I love the concept of my data doesn't have to be perfect. Because I think a lot of times, especially data scientists will do this. I've got to cleanse all my data because it's a science, right? The science is everything is well known. There are no unknowns, right? That's how science likes to work. But there's this data engineering. Us engineers, I've got a CS degree and a double E degree, and so it's fuzzy, right? And that's something my professors taught me in engineering. You don't need to know exact. You need to know within, right? A range, right? So that's where we have to get to with data as well. Otherwise, we could be stuck trying to cleanse our data and spending all of our time cleaning our data without getting any valuable information out.
And at some level, the answer is it depends, right? Which is the classic lawyer example. But there are places where the answer has to be incredibly precise and accurate, right? And
like targeting systems of nuclear missiles,
right? And so,
for example. Well, maybe not.
Depending on the nature of the analytics you're using, you may actually have some systems where you really do have to do, I'll say, data preparation on your data collection to ensure that you don't drive to a wrong answer. But as you point out, there's just so many cases where that's just simply probably not really true, right? As in you can actually get very good analytic results out of data that's still good enough, right?
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I saw in this process was people, even though they collect all this data, they don't really know what they've done with it. So the notion of actually having, and I'll put it this way, a data library. In other words, there's actually value in knowing what you've done with your data from collection all the way through analysis. And I think that's another part of the data readiness is kind of maturing in how you actually handle your data. And I guess I looked at it this way, is that if the data really does represent strategic value to your organization, then it's worth paying attention to it, just like you would your money, right? You don't just go, oh, I collected a bunch of money, I earned a bunch of money. I don't know where I put it, but it's around here somewhere, right? Most people probably don't do that, right? Unless you have to still.
No, most people don't. Unless you have tons of it, right? And maybe that's the problem, Ron. Yeah, I mean, we generate so much data, right? And we collect it all and we store it, and because I feel that way about my own data, right? I've got a terabyte up in Azure cloud of personal data. Those are family videos and pictures, and my podcasts are stored up there. And I blew through a terabyte, and I was starting to run out of space, right? So all of a sudden, I started caring about data. I had a whole bunch of clips that were, copies of clips and things. So I started going through all my data and removing duplicates and things like that. So it's funny when you have abundance, you don't value it as much.
Right.
So maybe that's part of the problem that we're having.
On the other hand, when I know that there was this picture that was really, really cool that I took 2 to 3 years ago. How can I find it? Right? Oh my goodness. I do want to mention one other thing that I think, and this almost comes off as counterintuitive in some ways to what I said earlier about, I think the way that a lot of organizations can move forward is by don't boil the ocean, but start focused and let that grow. But even as you start on small things and focus on it, don't lose sight of the big picture. And I say that because one of the things that I've seen time and time again when we start trying to do real data analytics, right, to drive decisions, to drive strategic value, we also discover value that we weren't even looking for in the data, right? And that's kind of like the extra pot of gold that you really weren't expecting, but that you just kind of run into. But it's important to have that kind of mindset of that while I'm working on a focused set with an intended outcome, I'm always kind of keeping in mind what's the bigger picture of my strategic goals for the organization and pay attention to that. Again, back to that maintenance example, one of the things that we learned out of that study, besides the fact that we had a lot of dirty data, besides the fact that we had so much data that we actually were able to get some good analytics, despite the fact that we had some dirty data. Because we learned all the early things about changing that data collection process to just sort of inherently try and improve that. But what we also found were some interesting things about what was our hypothesis of what needed to be done to improve maintenance versus what the data started showing us. And one of the things that the data showed us was there are certain parts that you send back for maintenance and repair that are just lemons, which is to say, you're going to get that part and it's going to go get repaired and it's going to come back into the stockpile and darn it, it's going to be bad. If not immediately, sometime really soon. In other words, there's something about how our process of repair and test that is clearly not sufficient, but we haven't nailed it down yet. So you can use that one to say, okay, that means there's something we need to learn about how we do that repair and that testing. But you can also say at some level, it's actually cheaper just to say, you know what, if I have a part that gets past a certain point of how many times it goes for repair, throw it away. It's actually cheaper and faster just to get it out of the stockpile than it is to keep fighting it and let it become a bigger part of your maintenance cycle and problem, right? And that wasn't necessarily
those are great. Yeah, those are great nuggets, right? When you actually run into that, right? Where, wow, I learned something new. So I like your idea is stay focused, but keep one eye wandering around and looking at, hey, what other additional things can I learn from the data? Great great insight into data, especially now that data is becoming, we've heard data is the new oil, whatever. But now with generative AI, I think it's starting to unleash some of that data even more. And like you said before, I can see some new things happening when someone's filling out a form, that it's not just a static form anymore, that a Gen AI could be asking questions and converse with the person to get information out. Like if they say, hey, what's the status of this, doohickey on the aircraft? And they go, I love my mom. It's going to go, that's great. You love your mom. Can you look at this thing, please?
So,
is it black? Is it white? Is it pink? Is it, it's something more interactive to spur on and help people get over their stuff.
And in places where that data collection really is, I'll say a big deal, because in some cases, maybe you really don't care that much, right? But there are a number of places where it really matters. And I've seen systems where we say, well, let's reduce how much free text input we ask for. And so what that means is we now go in and we say, okay, now you have a pick list. And you have to pick one of these things. And I'll tell you, inevitably, when I get confronted with a pick list, the majority of the time, I don't
pick the second one.
No, none of these things in the list fits, but I can't get past it until I pick one of them. And so if I had some ability for those things that really matter to say, let's interact with that person at some level and say, so, talk to me. Why don't these fit? What's something to help build a level of understanding that could be really, really cool in my mind, right?
Yeah, see, another great use case for generative AI to help in data collection and getting information from the real world. Ron, it's always a pleasure talking to you. We always have fun talking. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you, Darren. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to Embracing Digital Transformation today. If you enjoyed our podcast, give it 5 stars on your favorite podcasting site or YouTube channel. You can find out more information about Embracing Digital Transformation at embracingdigital.org. Until next time, go out and do something wonderful.